So I catched up today. So I don't have any reflection too much on the 2 weeks before because I kind of lost it. Like it seems like the weekly thing is actually important for a reason. Like if you extend things beyond a week, like I don't think you retain it. Like maybe that's why a week has 7 days or something. It's like has to do with retention capacity of humans. Anyway, yeah. So it was really interesting watching last week's episode because I had my own ideas, but the participation is different through video than when you're there, right? And you're not steering the conversation, but you're reflecting to it. And I made a ton of comments, and I wanna go through them. They're all on the web page of the YouTubes from the videos, so we can actually get some views going because there's more of us here than there are views. Anyway, I think I found the thing remarkable. Well, yeah, I was talking to Mark earlier about the structure, about the onion-like structure, but the thing that I realized is the fractal nature of the argument and the way in which it is fractal, and that is the thing that just caught my eyes. Like, oh, like there's actually a pattern that is it's not cyclical, it's spiral. Like it's literally spiraling because it's not ending in itself. It's ending upward into the whole, or it's entering downward into the part. And yeah, like that's some fancy trick and a way of thinking that I think we all have been struggling with in some way. So maybe this will actually provides tools for a breakthrough in that sense. So I guess I'm gonna be trying to use that lens today when attending to what's going on, trying to relate things to the fractal nature and figuring out the use and the limitations of that line of thinking. So, Danny, you want to give your reflection?
So my intention to engage last week was kind of more pertaining to motivation. I'm just curious. I'm still curious to. I didn't really get that from last week, so I guess I'm still kind of hovering there. I'd like to kind of get a better understanding of what the thing is that moves. Like if you have an idea, like you should get out of bed and clean your room. How did they, how did they link that to actually lighting the fire, or so like their conceptions of desire. So I don't really have a lot to contribute for reflection, other than like my mind is still kind of hovering in the same place. So yeah, I don't really have much, I guess, on the way of reflection from last week. I mean, I can kind of summarize for the group, I guess, to jog people's memory. We talked about the 3 virtues of wisdom, courage, and temperance. And then Manuel was well, I'll let you speak for yourself. I won't put words into your mouth.
Yeah, so I actually have been thinking about the same things that you're struggling with, how to connect motivation to conviction. So that's been on my mind as well. So we might dabble into that. Adam, you want to go next?
I wasn't here last week. The previous week, I set my intention to basically be something to the degree of engaging with the topic and the discussion and where I think I can offer some perspective or historical context to the ancient world in which this is taking place. I try and do that. So I'm doubling down on that intention, in spite of the fact that I wasn't here last week. And yeah, so in that way, I don't really have much of a reflection on the previous conversation. But I'll be looking through the text as we're discussing it, just to see if anything stands out to me historically or in the discussion at present. AC.
So, reflection from last week really got me thinking about the good and what it is, like how we actually know the good. And something came to mind as like the good as like a rock, like a foundation. Somehow it made me think of the Psalms, Hail the Rock Who Saves Us. I can't remember which psalm that was, but yeah, that's what I remember from last week. And what would my intention be for this one? Boy, the first half of this book was interesting. I guess we'll be going through it, but wasn't quite sure what to think. The latter half of the book got more into what you think of as Plato and espousing his ideas, and that's more what I'm interested in, and like how he's set up his ideal and what we can pick apart from it and how it's useful, discerning what justice is. Okay, so Mark.
Sure. So yeah, last week was interesting. I think it just encourages me to think more about virtues and values, and sort of inspired my, as it always does, my weekly live stream, which was Telos last night. So yeah, and then in reading 5, you really get that sense for that onion-like quality that Dr. Lanton Jack talked about in his expose on the Republic. And yeah, I mean, this chapter seems like it's 2 different books, right? Like it just seems like there's 2 pieces, because the first part and the second part are vastly different from one another in many, many ways. But you can see that mirroring, that echoing of, that's been throughout. And one of the more interesting things for me was just the realization that Socrates flat out says dialectic has nothing to do with contradictions and opposites. So it's not dialectic. If you're doing that, I was like, wow, well, no one's mentioned that before, because it would specifically push back against Hegel. For example, this is Hegel's wrong. Okay, fine, I'm good with Hegel being wrong. That's true. So yeah, the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis is wrong, because dialectic doesn't have that quality by definition, according to Plato. So yeah, it's different from the Platonic dialectic. It's also useless. So Plato's got it right again. It's weird to me that everybody misses that, or no one seems to mention it. And also the whole idea in there that you can't divide people into men and women. You have to divide them by task, right? By the eidos of the task. And then you can ignore, right? And that gets back to tell us again, like, no, you ignore that category, that ontology, because it's not relevant, right? The relevancy is in whether or not they can do the job or be a good at doing the job. So I found that interesting. So I'm looking forward to engaging with that. I guess it's Ethan's turn then.
Reflection on last week and intention for this week. Well, reflection on last week kind of goes well with the stream. Theme of the stream last night is telos, and I really like the part in book 4 where they talk about getting caught up in like losing sight of your telos, so or losing sight of the good. Like people that are their telos is medicine, end up just keep inventing new illnesses and never actually cure themselves. And the same thing with lawyers. Their telos is the law, so they just keep finding things illegal or trying to legislate over and over again. Intention for this week is to understand a little bit better what the heck is going on with these women and children and common marriages, common children, trying to figure out what Socrates is pointing at here. So I wasn't able to finish book 5. I got through the first half. So
Okay. Yeah. So let's roll back a little bit about last week, so we can do the roll up of the last week with my comments on it together. So the first comment I made was,
it's got a whole essay here for us.
yeah,
Oh, really?
I do have a whole essay, and a lot of it
A lot of
was
work.
in relation to you, Ethan. You said
Right.
the idea of withholding information from people who don't have any way to relate to it, like that really appealed to me. Because that sounds like a good way to put boundaries on your interaction with people, right? Like what am I providing to you? Because yeah, like the fact that someone is interested doesn't mean that you should give in to their appeal to interact or to commune. It's like, no, I am able to judge whether you can commune with me on the thing that I'm expert on. So yeah, that's something that I personally want to explore. Then going through, oh yeah, we ended up with courage, which was Danny's favorite subject. The first thing, oh yeah, the idea that courage applies just to the individual, I think, is flawed, and that's an inherent conception from individualism. When you are courageous, you have a conception of goodness that is conflicting with your self-interest or with your ego, right? Or the impulse that is going from your ego. And privilege the thing that is not your ego, right? Like true belief over the thing that appears to you as real, to your senses and to your feelings. And that commitment, right? Like that going through and superimposing is an act of courage, because now you're doing something that feels like a detriment to yourself. And then the question is, well, do we have right courage or wrong courage, right? So we need to have a justification for the courage. Yeah. So the thing that is the justification for your courage is the body outside of yourself, right? The thing that's bigger than yourself that you're conforming to, right? And that's why I think courage is not related to the individual, because like it's courage is that which allows you to engage in transformation, and that is necessarily towards something that is outside of you. Did that land,
It's very
Danny?
important that these virtues are not located within individuals. They're things that individuals conform to outside of themselves.
And struggle with.
Yeah, this week I was listening to Ben Shapiro, and he keeps talking about we have no individual justice, and every time he said that, I went like this.
Then, yeah, Danny hit on the point of aggression being part of courage, right? And I identified the aggression in the courage as the breaking of the framing, like your personal framing. Like you need to have a power inside of you that's capable of overcoming that with your reciprocal narrowing, right? Like that which closes you off from the world, right? And that's a spirit, right? And like a spirit that can do that is aggression, right? Like aggression is a really powerful way to transcend whatever you're at, right? Like because you can ignore pain, for example, through that. And then, oh yeah, and then this is a correction to you, Ethan, because you said that wisdom is judgment, but I don't think wisdom is relating to judgment. It's relating to discernment, and the judgment is relating to action. So right, like it's coming from the discernment into the implementation of the consequences of your discernment. And yeah, so I think that wisdom is related to seeing the whole, right? Because it's the head of the body, right? Like it's that which is responsible for the whole of the body, right? So that's the emanation which defines the telos of the body, right? Like it defines the way that, well, I guess we're going to use Veggi's word, structural functional organization that the body is going to be participating in. And then I started making this really crazy idea of. Go ahead.
Can you distinguish again between judgment and discernment, real quickly?
Well, the judgment is drawing implications, right? Like that's what judging is. It's like this means that, right? Like the fact that something is doesn't have implications in and of itself, right? Like the when you start putting it in relationship to you as an agent, right, and the implications for your action, then what is gets transformed in like you go from the is ought, right? You go over the is ought gap. That's where the judgment happens.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I didn't look up that word. In my translation, the word judgment is used. I wonder what the original Greek word is used. It would be actually interesting to see what it is and see if it
What
can
section is this?
It's 428b.
But judgment has to do with justice, right? Like there's a reason why
Yeah.
justice is being done by judges, right? Like,
Good counsel. That's what they use in this book. There's no judgment here. It's just good counsel.
right, and well, counsel doesn't have to do with what you should do. It's like how you should make your
Right. It's advice.
decisions.
Yeah.
It's yeah. Yeah, I think that sounds better. Okay.
Then oh yeah, so now I made this setup and I'll post it in the chat so that you guys can look at it. So they're talking about these four virtues, and I didn't have a list of what they were called, but so you have so you have wisdom, which is related to discernment of what we relate to, right? Which is providing the grounding of our action or whatever. And then we have courage. Is the courage is the thing that allows us, that orients us to the thing that's a problem or that we need to face, right? Like and it's defining the relationship that we're engaging in as well, right? So I connected that to the shadow, right? Like because the shadow is the thing that you're not dealing with, right? Like that the thing that needs attention, and the courage is the thing that allows you to face the thing that needs attending. And but yeah, like about the courage, like that's the I'm a little bit iffy about that, but I think it's somewhat correct. And then temperance, or I don't know what word they were using, is in the relationship, right? So we've established the relationship, and so like now where are we in that relationship? Like how does that relationship look like, right? Like So it's weighing, and then the justice is all of the entities maintaining their place. So it's like the thing that I saw. So I think using the idea of defining the role that you're in, the identity, right? Like so that's the way that you're having your relationship, right? And but that's in some sense it's sense making within the relationship, while justice is the implementation or right relationship. And yeah, you can read what I wrote because I wrote it in a somewhat different framing. But the important thing that I saw here is it's like the process of emanation or something, right? Like there's a way in which you go down the hierarchy and you start changing the aspect, and then when you come in justice, right, you have identified a organ of the body effectively, right? You have identified, or you're at a thing that is in relationship to other things in the body, right? And then that entity also has its own wisdom, right? Like that has its own body that needs to go, and then it has its own courage, right? And that's where the fractal-like nature comes out, right? It's like, oh, like the same principle goes again and again and again. Yeah, I'll stop there because we probably need to discuss this a lot. Did that make sense?
No, not particularly. But I don't think it's relevant. I mean, I talked about all that stuff in book 4, so.
This justice, proper action within the identity being in relation to all other identities. It's a kind of an inverse, but also consequence of wisdom.
Yes.
Look, you need temperance and courage to enact justice, and therefore justice is a second order emanation. Unlike temperance and courage, they're not of the same type.
Are you saying that justice is kind of like sitting on a tripod of temperance, wisdom, and courage? In the sense that it's a higher
I don't
entity?
think. No, it's not sitting on anything. It's an emanation. It comes down from above. It doesn't need to sit on anything. It imposes itself on everything else. And then because of that, proper justice requires wisdom, courage, and temperance to implement. But that means that justice isn't at the same level as the things that implement it, right? It has to be second order in that way.
Yeah, the way I look at it is like a distillation, right? So you put the thing that you orient as the body towards, right? And it goes through wisdom, and then it goes through courage, and then it goes through temperance, and then justice is how the body starts responding to the outside, right? So now it goes back up, right? Like now it's allowing the body to change identity, right? Because like in order to be just when we're being attacked by the enemy, like we need to have a war economy or something, right? So my proper action now is to make swords instead of plows, for example. Okay. What did I have more? The idea of the part and the whole, right? Like justice is in some sense the thing that is combining the part and the whole in the dynamic. It's like completing it. And then, well, yeah, the other thing that I was intrigued about is this idea, right? Like they say, justice comes from a man being just, right? So like that's the second order effect, right? But that also means that justice doesn't exist, right? Like it manifests, like it has no separate existence from its manifestation. And so trying to
I don't know about that. I don't know where you're getting that from.
because
It's an emanation.
like,
It exists
yeah.
apart from whether it's implemented or not. Otherwise, you have no form to conform to, and therefore, in the Platonic sense, you can't manifest it.
Yeah, but I think the description that they gave has no form.
Oh, I agree. I agree with that. Oh yeah. He's playing with stuff for sure, but he admits that he's not. That's not his definition of justice. Is not in form.
Okay, well,
So, I agree.
then so far, justice is a formless thing.
Can you say that again? Justice is a form of what?
Formless thing. It doesn't have a form. Yeah, in chapter 4 it doesn't. That's why he throws it out and goes to chapter 5. Yeah, that's the whole pattern of the book. Oh yeah, look, this doesn't work. Let's try again. Oh yeah, look, this doesn't work. Let's try again. Right? That's the book.
Yeah. So, like last week, you guys ended on justice, and we're like, well, maybe we need to dig into it a little bit more. Like, are you guys satisfied around justice, or?
I'm not.
What do you? Is there something from 4 you want to know, Danny, or is that going to get resolved in 5, or at least the latter half of 5?
I gotta finish the entire Republic, I think, to resolve it. But
Yeah.
I can see patterns and sense them. I just can't put words on them. I mean, one thing that jumped out to me of what I've been thinking about everything you've been saying, and I haven't been saying much, but like in the terms of connecting the shadow on courage, I wonder where courage comes from. So, I mean, I don't know if that seems to be the key. Like courage seems to be the key locomotive thing that kind of puts the other stuff into action, right? Like that's what it strikes me as. Is it like?
Well, but the courage comes from the wisdom, I think, right? You have the discernment through wisdom, like, oh, I see a part of my shadow, right? And then the courage is like, now I engage with that.
The ancient Greeks were all passion. Everything comes from passions, and then it divided out into passions. And so courage is a function of controlling your passions. It's a different type of control from temperance. But where does courage come from? Courage comes from the wisdom plus the passion. Like and you cultivate it. It's not a thing that you're granted. It doesn't pre-exist in that way. It pre-exists in the form way, Plato. It doesn't pre-exist in the way of, well, there's a courage over there, and you can just like grab one, and then you have it. That's not.
And the courage is placing the ideal over the actual. Like that's what it is.
So there's definitely an election of, like they construct an ideal, but the thing about courage is that they give warlike imagery, and that they speak of necessity. And then, so in discussing in chapter 5, when they speak of the difference between men and women, they often also just in terms of like, why is this thing of this thing and that thing of that thing, they talk about the necessity of the thing. That's what, I mean, that's just what I'm thinking about is like, what's at the core of courage? Why do you need, I don't know. Again, this is kind of getting into the motivation thing. I'm just
pay the enemy off, right? Like if the enemy is at the gate, you can say, well, if we give you all our gold, wait. Like you don't have to fight. But then you're no longer who you used to be. Like,
courage, in some sense, is merely the willingness to sacrifice for the ideal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And making that decision is a function of wisdom, and implementing that is, that's where the courage lies. And then sometimes you run out, right? Like if you don't make the decision to go meet the enemy before they get to the city, then you're going to have to capitulate something at some point.
I think a better way of looking at courage is the ability to live in faith.
Right.
Oh yeah, I really like that actually. It's reminding me of telos, right? When we were talking about yesterday. If you have a telos which is not located, it's potential, right? You're having faith in that potential. Like so, for example, good father, right? I have faith in that higher principality that I put my identity in, and then that determines how that that courage and faith in that higher ideal will determine how I live out my life or whatever.
Yeah, and again, going back to how do you get to do things, right? Like there's two things, right? Like one, and they've been talking about it, is being driven by fear, right? Like, oh, I'm scared about this, so I'd better be doing that, which is a lesser form, right? Like this is the complaint about religious people. Like they're all afraid of going to hell, and then they're not really good people. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Like you're not a good person if you're doing things on that basis. And the other part is like you do things for the ideal, right? You're motivated by the intrinsic quality, and like they go in the end of chapter 5, they talk about this, right? It's like if you can truly see the thing for what it is, right? Like then you're one type of person, and you know it, right? And this is again the knowing by participating in the being, right? And if you don't have that, if you don't have that quality, then you're living in an illusion. Like you're living in a fantasy. Like it's not real.
Yeah, I like that courage as opposed to fear.
Does
It's
that
like
clear it up for you, Danny? Does that give you some more to think chew on, or
What it is, defining it as a concept, I don't have an issue with. It's more of, I mean, I don't have like a logical. It's probably not a rational thing. I just know the language they use to describe courage. They say it's like it's kind of salvation. It's this fear-like thing. It's this like very extreme thing. They're not as extreme with the other ones, right? That's why I say it seems to be a key. Like it seems to be qualitatively very different than anything else that's come up in the Republic so far, to me.
it is because it's about ultimate sacrifice.
Right? Yeah.
It's about the ability to manifest. Like without courage, you can't manifest. You can't take responsibility. You can't do all these things.
Yeah. So I guess I was maybe just observing that. So
Like you have to have the knowledge of the good from wisdom for courage to be able to manifest. Right?
No, I think you can be courageous towards the wrong thing.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I don't think you need. I don't think you need knowledge. Right? You can just do things not knowing, and that's courageous in and of itself, right? Because you're going into a territory where you can't sense make.
they did talk about courage in the context of the purple dye thing, and said you need to start with pure white. And so I wonder if there's something there, like maybe you don't want your courage to be applied to the wrong thing. Like maybe you want to make sure that you're starting with purity, and then implement the courage.
Right. Well, and that's their right. They do another absurdity. We're going to start with a pure person, right? Which they know that they state that doesn't exist, right? So they're deliberately trolling at some point, right? They're deliberately just telling you things that they know are garbage to exemplify something. I mean, that's the purpose of good philosophy, is to exemplify one particular aspect. So they, and they do. I mean, this is the pattern of the book throughout, right? They make these absolutist universalist statements that are absurd for the purpose of exemplifying what they're talking about, and the fact that even in a perfect world where you have all these false dichotomies, this doesn't work. You can set up a world with perfect false dichotomies, and it doesn't work. Right? And that's the important part. And it's the same thing with courage. You're not going to get to the bottom of courage without solving a bunch of unsolvable problems, which in which case they're probably not problems, right? Just without these constraints that are universal. And that's just the way it is. So it's not like we're born into courage, right? We develop it. Again, it's something you develop. Not everyone can be courageous, and not everybody can be equally courageous. Again, it's not a thing you can go grab out of your backyard and say, I have 2 courages, and Ethan only has a half a courage, and yeah, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, they're ethereal things, not material things that can be. I mean,
Well, it's not even manifestable. I think that's the courage isn't manifestable. It's second order effect of things like temperance and right, and that's the key, is that there is a hierarchy within the virtues, and that's where people get confused, and that's why we have the true, the good, the beautiful at the top.
So you can't have, right, like, okay, the enemy's there, right, that's my wisdom, and it needs to be defeated, right? So that now I have a telos, right? Now I'm courageous, I'm facing the enemy, and then what? Right, like, do I go in berserker style? Do I go like in a phalanx? Like what's the way? Like, do I murder the whole enemy, or do I capture them? Right, like, the fact that I'm courageous doesn't give me an answer of how to be within the telos, even if I've engaged in that relationship, right? So that's where the temperance comes in, right? And then the justice is in the execution, right? Like is the phalanx actually being a phalanx when engaging?
I think an important point that I don't know if it was mentioned since we started discussing is if you start at utility versus goodness. I think that has a huge. If you start what they do in the Manuel, this is was one of Manuel's big observations, in my opinion, is in the Republic they start with utility. They say we're doing this for the utilitarian lens for the state. And when you look at courage, or any of these things that way, wisdom or temperance, when you start with utility as what your telos, your corollaries are like, you don't really have a lot of wiggle room to, like, it's pretty much predetermined where you go with that.
Right.
So like, if let's say I've got this pulled up, Manuel's comment on courage and about you have an ideal, and your conception of how you, like, I need to clean my room, is that utilitarian or is that good? Do I need to clean my room because it would be a good thing to have me in a state of...
They're not exclusive. That's what people get wrapped up in, right? Yeah. And part of the project of the Republic is to say, all right, let's build a totally utilitarian system around the stuff we are sure of. And look, it doesn't work. Okay, good. Well, that's good to know. It's just a refutation of utilitarianism as such. Yeah. And that's why when people go, I'm a utilitarian, I'm like, do you read? Have you read a book? Because no, like, it's just absurd.
But if you take the flip side of the equation, right? Like, if you're taking the good and you can't implement it, right? Which is what all these these people are doing, right? Like these postmodernists, like, oh, this is good, right? And then it can't happen. Then you're on the other side, right? So you need to have the utilitarian capacity to manifest, and you need to have the intrinsic idealistic nature that you conform to.
So you just can't reduce it, and the utilitarians reduce it to one side, and the postmoderns reduce it to the other side, and they're both wrong. And it's not that hard. It just sucks because now you get to track more than one variable. Yeah, life is a multivariate equation, right? Like that, and that's what people don't like. They're like, it's too complex. It's like, well, but that's too bad because it is.
And like, this is why I like the body language, right, and the submission thing, right? Because like you cannot manifest the good without a body, right? Without it functioning properly. Like it's a necessity. Like you can't get around it. And then, well, like, then the question is, well, how do we do that, right? Like how do we fit in, right? And I think I think the way that we're using submission, like, is highly analogous to justice. Like in some sense, there's not much difference between how Plato uses judgment just as in book 4, and how we use submission.
Yeah, I think that's where people again they kind of get wrapped up, right? Because they don't want to see it in that fashion. They just want it to be different without understanding that it cannot be different. And that's really what the Republic shows, is it cannot be different from how it is. The book just seems to be an experiment in, let me show you why things are as they are and cannot be any different. And people got wrapped up in wanting things to be completely apart. And book 5 goes into that with the importance of the body, right? They actually touch on that, at least in the first part.
Yeah, so it's interesting how they introduce it, right? Because there's a little story going in, right? And then it's like they're talking, and then what stood out to me is the tension of discord, right? Because they're discordant with Socrates' layout, right?
Yes.
And then Socrates is like, well, and they're like, well, we don't like to do that because we're disruptive, right? So the discord is putting on a constraint, and Socrates is having an explorative mindset, right? And so these are intention, right? And if we're going to the idea of dialogos or whatever, right? Like I think that's the dynamic, right? Like it's the imposition of constraints and the exploration, and what is the correct means of navigating that, and like they highlight that part in the play, I guess, part of
Right,
the book.
but that's the interesting thing, is they introduce two concepts, well, a bunch of concepts, but two main concepts all at once, right? Oh, we don't want to just object. Really? Why not? Right? Because this is revealed later. Because that's not dialectic. If your job is to object and find an opposite, then you're not doing dialectic according to Plato. Period. Full stop. End of statement. Right? But the other thing is that in the beginning here, what they're actually talking about is what he didn't address. Right? He's saying, well, you haven't gone back and addressed, well, we'll say the inconsistencies between right, robbing us of a whole section of the argument, right? And what he's saying is, well, yeah, and that's because I'm not trying to give you an answer. I'm trying to explore a topic. And it is the spirit of exploration that is the dialectic, which is why you can't just be in opposition to it. Like if you're doing the thesis antithesis thing, you're not in dialectic according to Plato, because you're doing the opposite of an exploration, because all you're doing is fighting against the explorer. And I talk a lot about this. There's a type of conversation that's exploratory. It's exemplified in the Republic. Who knew? Never would have guessed. Of course I figured it was in the Republic. It had to be. Plato's not an idiot. It's not. It can't be a unique observation to me. I never for a second thought that. So you can see that this whole thing, and Socrates just lays it out in the beginning of book 5. I am not giving you answers. I'm not telling you I've got this figured out. I'm exploring this with you. And the reason why I haven't mentioned it yet is because it looks hard and I didn't want to go there yet. And they're basically saying we have to go there.
Also, he's going one step further. It's like I'm kind of disagreeing with myself. I'm ashamed to to take this step.
Right, so, right. And that's when he finds a problem in the exploration and starts over. Right. And in book 5 is again, it's a starting over. You're starting over.
And then he's saying something else, which is also really interesting in relation to Vivek. He's like, affirmation is only necessary when you believe you have the truth, right? So I am not affected by your discord because you're not affecting me, because I'm looking at the truth, and I'm like, if I stand here or I stand here, like I don't care, because I'm still oriented towards the truth. And like there's more in there than it seems, because like this you can use this as a rule when you judge people, right? It's like, oh, like you get upset when I disagree? Oh. Like, you must seem to think that you hold a truth, right? Instead of that you're partaking in the being of truth.
Or the exploration, right? Like you can't be exploring if you're objecting. That again, that's what he said. You're not in dialectic if you're objecting and only objecting, right? That's not dialectic anymore.
Protesting would be a better word. If you're protesting, you're not in dialect.
Yeah, well, there's lots of similar phrases that are dead on for the same thing. Because we just keep inventing new words to avoid falling into what Socrates talks about here. And it's like, well, that's cute, but also no. I mean, you're just using a new word to get around being guilty of what he's accusing you of.
Mm-hmm. So he's lifting out a space between birth and education, and I found that really, really nice because like you're not being educated when you're a baby, and the way that I framed that was it's laying the foundation, right? So there's a place where you build the foundation, and then you can start building your knowledge upon the foundation that you've laid, right, through education. So yeah, I really like that distinction. Does anybody want to butt in? Because well, I guess we haven't gone far yet. But
Well, one thing I think it might be important is to fortify the. Mark made the observation about Bloom. His version, you had language like heuristics versus dialectic, but you can't put things into opposition. I think it's important to maybe cite some sources. That's in 454a, because I think that's an important point that we're going to stand on. So it might make sense to fortify it. It's in 455a when they're talking about the power of the art of contradiction. My translation uses a simpler language. But it says, this is the great power of contradiction. Why do you say so? Because I think a man falls into the practice against his will. I thought that was an interesting observation. I didn't know what was there. But he thinks he's reasoning, and he's really just disputing because he can't define and divide. So it's like because you lack proper discernment, you get into the spirit of contention, and therefore you can't have a fair discussion. To me, that's it. To me, they were making a statement more about like the spirit of, like the spirit. Again, like what kind of attitude you have when you come to the table. What lens are you using?
No. I think it's telos. He's talking about telos, right? If you don't share a telos, you cannot like this is the problem with all arguments online, right? Like people don't share a telos, and then they're talking, and then they're pretending that they're talking to each other, but they're talking to themselves.
Yeah, they're explicit about that. They say, why do we, valiantly insist on verbal truth, but there's a differences in our pursuits. Our pursuits are not the same, and therefore we cannot have meaning the same. We cannot share the same meanings if we don't have the same pursuits. They say it explicitly, 454b.
Right.
So.
Right, and that's because meaning springs from content plus context. And so if your context, which is determined by your telos, is not the same, and that's what the essence of online trolling. That's where it comes from. Like we're playing a game that you don't understand, and we're going to play your game within your rules, but we're really playing our game, right? And so it's a self-referential, purely parasitic, by the way, but way fun. Way of interacting with people based on this very principle. It's based on the principle that, well, if I'm talking about something else, or I'm not being serious when you're being serious, then it's just funny. It's a funny contrast or whatever. That's the essence of trolling, and then in C 454C they go into proper categorization, right? Proper ontology. That's what the next section is about, is proper ontology.
So Manuel, I don't know if you were going somewhere with connecting education to ontology or categorization, but I just thought it was important to cite before we moved on to the whole, because the men and women thing, it's kind of messy. Like, do they have different natures? They say the dogs don't have the different natures. They should do the same tasks. They talk about how
it's not natures. No, they don't say dogs don't have different natures. That's not what they say. They say with respect to action, because you're judging action and you're ignoring nature. It's see, we get confused because we're trying to do the object thing. We're trying to go, oh, a dog is an object of type with properties. No, it's not.
Well,
Plato's just saying, no, that's not how you think about it ever. That's what he's saying. You don't think about it that way ever. He's saying the way to think about it is in terms of, we'll call it available telos or something, right? Like either the dog's a good hunting dog or it's a good something else dog, right? And therefore the fact of the breed and the fact of what color it is and the fact of how big it is irrelevant. And right, and so this is the relevance realization. What again, proper categorization is relevance realization. It doesn't make any sense when talking about guardians to divide guardians into men and women. That doesn't make any sense because the act of guardying, right, of being a guardian, has nothing to do with men or women. It's a form that just doesn't involve itself in these other characteristics. And then he explicitly says this, like the manifestation's irrelevant. It's like he's not talking about equality in terms of outcome. He's talking about equality in terms of task to do, right? And that's it. That's where the equality is. It's the ultimate egalitarian argument.
He's making a capacity argument. Right? He's relating to potential.
Right. But that's egalitarianism. It's saying if you can do the job, you're allowed to do the job. And that's the only standard for doing the job. Right? It's like it's purely self-referential in that way. Right? It's just saying if you're good at killing people, then you're good at killing people, and therefore we should let you kill people.
So they say
it doesn't talk about the other ostensible theoretical properties of men or women or dogs or anything else.
Yeah, so whatever it is that they're on about, which I'm not sure exactly what it is, it's a higher thing because they say idiosyncratically in the individual desires, women can be better than men at things. Like, sure, fine, you want to be, but whatever the unifying principle, there's a theme of unity in this chapter, and they say the physician. Right. When we call somebody a physician, we're saying the class. If this you're a physician of mind, right? And so
that's small o ontology.
Yeah,
right?
whatever their
categorization as such, and they're privileging the categorization over the things in the category. And we get that backwards because when we say objective material reality or science, we're trying to give the objects the primacy. And what Plato is saying is objects do not have primacy. What has primacy is their function.
So men and women are of the same nature, and that we're subordinated to the same thing, whatever the thing is that they're trying to point to, whatever it is. They're pointing up. Yeah, the city. Yeah,
the city.
And they're saying that is what unifies men and women. So they're saying like, hey, we're trying to get at something over here, but it's not useful to thinking of men and women as different is kind of like talking about a hairy versus non-hairy carpenter. So not what we're on about, right? We're on about some unifying principle. Like that's what they're trying to point to.
Yeah. So this is in some sense an expansion of the idea of temperament, right? So okay, what is my relationship, right? And the relationship that I have is the role that I'm in, right? So the role is determining my identity, and that's what they're doing. And so what is the best example of a role of a human being? Well, that's their sex, right? So what they're doing is they're taking the most fundamental way of understanding a role, and they're just cutting it down. They're saying it's invalid to make this judgment. And I think that's the trick. It's like, okay, like I take down the biggest problem that I can tackle, and therefore it's universally true across every category.
Well, and also they're re-invoking this: don't create problems where there aren't problems, right? If you start from the frame of men and women are different, you've created a bunch of problems that don't need to be there with respect to being a guardian. Because with respect to being a guardian, the apparent frame that men and women are different on average is irrelevant, because being a guardian doesn't care about that difference. It's not interesting or important, right? And that's the relevance realization. So yes, you can look, and this is the problem. I mean, that Vervaeke talks about with combinatorial explosion. You can find an infinite number of similarities or differences between men and women. So what? That's not interesting or important. What's important is the telos, right? Okay, well, if the telos is to raise children, now we can, if the telos is to protect the city, now we can do something useful with that. And ignoring the end result because you're not interested in the end result in terms of men and women fixes everything so that the problem never manifests. So in other words, the fact that you're going to end up with fewer women in combat is not considered a problem because your goal was never to get equality. And if your goal isn't to get equal representation, then you don't create the problem. The problem only exists within the telos. Mm-hmm. So if the telos is good guardian, the fact of men and women is not relevant. It's not interesting, it's not important, and it's not considered.
And so
that's the opposition again.
I wrote down this is an argument against absolutism, right, or dogmatism in some sense, right, because that's implicitly what it is. Like, oh, man, woman, right, and then therefore, right, is saying the frame of man, woman is defining how the world should be or whatever, right, or how the world is. And so I think what he's doing is he's making this trick of basically undermining your sense making and reorienting it in a different way. Like he's engaging with your fundamental sense making at this point.
Yeah, and just as in recent times, we've been sort of trained to pay attention to an arbitrary physical manifestation that doesn't exist and isn't helpful. And because of that, we're acting as if we always have to consider that. But the fact of the matter is we absolutely do not. It's just a stupid game. And if you don't play, everything's fine and everything works better. And so the minute you drop this idea that the fact of difference as such is important, which again is explicit in the beginning of book 5, everything solves itself because those problems that would have been created never get created, ever. It's just not a factor, right? And so, for example, if you do good work in your craft, let's say you're a software engineer, right? The fact that you do good work is not affected by the failure or success of the company. Because the company, it doesn't depend only on your work. Like, the best software in the world, and if the marketing's terrible, no one's going to know about it. If the best software in the world, if the funds are mismanaged by the chief financial officer, it won't see the light of day, right? The worst software in the world, and if it's well marketed, it will sell. That's called vaporware. Like this is everywhere. That's an indication that you're paying attention to the wrong thing. And it's funny because that all came up in my live stream last night. Is that you can use the manifestation of whatever people are doing to determine what their telos actually is, even when they don't know it. But seeing the manifestation and seeing what they're paying attention to, or just asking what they pay attention to often, will tell you right away if their telos is any good. And that's what this is pointing to.
So, yeah, a couple things jumped out to me. So I have here capacity versus attunement, right? So, like, he's talking about, well, they could become guardians, right? But then they have to become guardians, right? Like, so there's an implementation aspect, and I brought that up into where does this utility, right? Like, give into fate, right? Because like at a certain point, your predictive capacity is like you don't know what a baby can do, right? Like that. Maybe if you have a 5-year-old, right, you can say, well, like they might become a lawyer or a politician, right? And you might be like accurate like 50% of the time or something.
Not
right?
even close.
Maybe, but you like that's conceivable, right? So there's this aspect where you're looking at a potential and which is real, right? Which is justified. That maybe that's the word that I should be using. There's a justified potential, and then there's a hope or something, right? That you believe in. Yeah. I found that line interesting.
Yeah, and the other concept in there, especially with and see what war is like so that they'll be better warriors, and then they're all objecting like, oh no, you can't risk the children in the war, and he's like, but it must be so, right? Because they have to see it exemplified in order to learn it. So the whole idea of mimicry, the whole idea of participatory quote knowledge, which is not knowledge, it's information, is right here in book 5, which I find fascinating. It's like we're still rediscovering Plato, huh? Well, that's good on us, I guess. Or we could have just read it and believed him. I don't know. By the way, Manuel, technically, statistically, you can't have a 50-50 representation on that, because children
to Manuel and he'll
Chil-
tell us.
well, yeah, children change, but also it's not, there aren't 2 items in the set, and therefore statistically it'll never be 50-50, but it'll be more like 1 in
No,
100.
but it's either true or it's not, right? And then you can like do a statistical analysis on.
No, you can't do
It doesn't
untrue or
matter.
not.
Like at some point, if you ever cross the threshold, like there's a threshold. Anyway, doesn't matter. Not relevant. Yeah. So are we done on the man-woman thing, or are we still having some?
Oh, it gets worse.
I don't know about that. I mean, it's just resolved by changing your telos.
Yeah.
Because then, again, the problem doesn't happen, and a problem that doesn't happen is technically resolved. Like,
Well, they get
we're never going to run into that wall.
Well, the next part they go into common marriages and common children and stuff like that, common families, which even
but again, you have to recognize the book is deliberately absurd, right? Again, it's trying to show you if the world were perfect and dichotomies, all of which are false, by the way, actually were implementable in the world, it still doesn't work. Like, this really is let me show you how stupid you're being. Like, that's the whole theme of the book is, let me show you how retarded you're actually being about this stuff. You cannot do this. And here's the proof that you cannot do it. We'll use logic, reason, and rationality, and we'll show you that even under the most ideal conditions you could possibly ever conceive of, none of this stuff is going to work out the way you think it could.
Yeah.
None of it.
But that goes to the point. Just to give some context, we get on to a strange concept later on in the book called the philosopher king. Now, why are these Greeks talking about a king? The last time there was any serious person who was termed by the name king in Greece to all the people in this conversation was the Iliad. It was King Agamemnon and Menelaus. They still had those original. The Athenians had a title for somebody, which was the same as king, but they weren't a king. They didn't even treat him in the same way. The Basileus. And again, even at this time, the king office wouldn't have. It was one of many different offices, so it is quite a ridiculous thing. I mean, it would take until about 2 generations after these men for any Greek city-state to be under somebody who called themselves a king, a basileus. Otherwise, it would have been some sort of assembly or a tyrant, and they would have just called themselves that. They're tyrannos. So this is a ludicrous conversation to all the people involved when they're talking about common families, and then they'll get onto the idea of a king. which it's not. It's non sequitur.
Yeah. Well, there's a point in there where Socrates is begging them to just let him say what he's about to say because they're trying to stop him. It's like, this is too crazy. This is way too crazy. Like, he says, just let me fantasize here. Just let me He said, he compares himself to somebody on vacation in their thoughts without any consequences. Something like that.
Right. Well, then that's the spirit of exploration. Like, yeah, and that's what everyone says they're longing for. I mean, in some sense, right? This is Jean-Francois Lyotard. And everybody wants to be able to do their unrestrained thought experiments with no consequences, right? And that's fine as long as you're not going to take an action in the world. But also, you're going to take an action in the world. So that's where it gets tricky. Is you can't just let people fantasize endlessly. And yeah, you can see that struggle underlies this chapter in particular, but I think it's probably throughout the whole book.
Oh, and maybe that is actually they're displaying one of these virtues, right? Like so maybe they're actually displaying temperance in the thing. It was like, oh yeah, I want to do this, but I'm not because like then the functioning of the body would not be proper.
Right.
Yeah.
If
So
everything were absolutely perfect, this is how the guardians would have to behave. To have the best children possible and the best marriages possible for the entirety of the society. To like exemplify
and you
temperance
can't.
and justice.
Well, and you can't allow them to have an alternative ideal like family, which is why they flatten it out, right? And family, it's actually relationship as such. I mean, in this model, they're just flattening everything to you are an individual within a city with a role, and they're separating out those roles in a very scientific, ontological way, right? And they're saying, all right, your role here can never have anything to do with anything but the city. So you can't have a familial connection whatsoever in order to perfectly implement Guardian. And it's like, oh, okay, fair. Like it's not logically inconsistent or incorrect. It's
and
not
it
wrong in
actually
any
happened.
fashion.
Like this is what eunuchs were, right? Like like this stuff happened. Like people did.
I was
this
thinking of that. Didn't they do something like this in Persia?
Yeah, and in China, yeah, like they did it in all
Yeah.
sorts of places.
Wait, what's the practice?
Eunuchs.
Like
Cutting
using
off
eunuchs
stuff
for war?
with
Oh
the
yes, court
hormones
eunuchs. Yeah, that's and the reason why that's the case, by the way, is because then you don't have somebody who is going to usurp or overthrow your dynasty because they can't perpetuate that dynasty. So the eunuchs, this is something that the Ottoman sultans did, and it was in some way it's quite effective. But again, to the Greeks, this would be foreign and it would be Persian, right? So it would be this is another all completely fantasy based sort of deal. Like the Greeks would probably look at eunuchs like we actually look at eunuchs, which is they're a mutilated body, and something's horribly wrong.
Right, which
yeah,
is why they don't go there. They go instead to we're just going to confuse everybody and mix up the children so that they can't. That way, we don't have to mutilate any bodies.
Yeah.
Fair enough. It's a nice compromise.
and also right, like the testicles make testosterone, right? So if you get rid of them, you have a lot more effeminate men. Like they
That's
won't
true. Yeah.
challenge you as much.
Yeah. They can't fight.
So yeah, make marriage beneficial is back to the utilitarian thing, and
They actually said we need to make marriage sacred. It's funny reading that at first,
Oh.
but by how they make it sacred is not how you would think. But yeah, they do another absurdity. They're practicing pseudo eugenics, I guess, or breeding. And he's like, well, we're just gonna have to trust that we have a higher authority that can make these judgments. And I think he says we'll just consult the oracle at Delphi. They'll tell us who needs to breed with who.
Right.
Just kind of sets it off their side. But yeah, very much kind of doing this philosophizing, like you say. They're kind of absolutizing things so that they can get a better idea of something.
Yeah, it's high. It's a very high contrast effort, but also to your point, they keep sneaking in the religious authority left, right, and center.
Yeah.
It's like religion is all throughout this book. It's absolutely it's dripping with it. And it's dripping with it in the way that it's not mentioned very often, but it's mentioned in relation to the most important decisions. All of the most important
Yeah.
decisions are
Well, the
effectively
exceptions.
appeals to religious authority. Every single one of them.
And it's so bizarre how they actually walk through the thought process. Like they bring up the dogs, the male and the female dogs, and say like, okay, well they kind of do the same function, same telos, and then they talk about the differences between men and women, and then suddenly they just say, oh well, we've got to have matrimony elevated highly because licentiousness is an unholy thing which the rulers which shall be forbidden. And yes, it ought not to be forbidden. Moving right along. Nothing to see here. Moving right along. It's crazy. It's like they're talking about the whole point of this is exemplifying the problem with categorizing things, and then they're just kind of like, okay, now that we've done that, moving right along, we're not going to try to build anything. We're just gonna, I don't know. I just think it's funny. I laughed. And they make jokes too, like when they talked about. I laughed like when they talked about the necessity. This is completely unrelated, so I don't know why I'm bringing this up other than it's funny. They say like men and women have a necessity to attract towards one another. They mention intercourse, but it's not the kind of necessity like a geometry. It's not a geometrical necessity. I swear that's got to be like an intentional joke. They have stuff.
Yes,
it's stuff like that.
Well, well, yeah, but actually, I made a comment around this, and it's like the law. So they're trying to get the individual to lose their individuality, right? Like you're not allowed to have your selfie space, and then they're like, oh, but there's nature, right? And there's laws of nature, and we gotta recognize that some things are just gonna happen, right? So this is the pragmatic implementation thing that they're shying away from, and they're bringing it back in, and then they say, well, but we can't really have that, but after the prime, right? After the prime, it's okay, right? So now we're just like making a section where things are not okay, and afterwards there's different rules, and then they're even more so. It's like, but if the oracle says something, then it can be different because like they're the higher authority. It's like, oh, okay, like you just like screwed up your whole system. Good, but yeah, I think that's in some sense they're foreshadowing this imperfection that has to exist, because like else it's just not going to be realistic at all. So
do you mind if I just close the circle real quick? I don't remember if Manuel connected. He mentioned that he noticed this morning that they use what did you say? Like they create tension with lenses. I don't remember what you mentioned, but that's what they're doing. Is that they keep on opposition. They're using opposition in order to be exploratory. And I think what you mentioned capacity versus attunement. That has to be what they're on about with the men and women thing, right? So it's like Paul Vanderklee might say like the spirit of like that's what the geometry joke about, like they're literally making sex jokes about being a math nerd. Like no, dude, like you're stuck in the textbook. It's like the difference in the spirit of finesse versus I don't remember what Paul Vanderklee's puts on the other side.
Geometry.
Spirit. Is it literally geometry? Oh, okay, that's funny.
Yeah, this is from Pascal. Okay. Pascal talks about this.
So, okay, so I don't know. Maybe they're bringing. I don't know if the spirit of finesse is what they're trying to bring into here, or
no, it is. It's exactly what they're pointing. That's exactly what the joke is.
Yeah, they're doing the propositional procedural thing, right? And they're like, well, yeah, there's this other thing, but we're not going to deal with it because we can't.
Right. It's all because we can't. Right. Well, and again, they exemplify that with the children. They say, look, we have to let some children die because they have to watch their parents. They have to watch the other guardians that they will become fight in war. We're just going to have to sacrifice a few of them because of that. And it's just like it's nothing, right? It's absolutely nothing to them because again, they're trying to do this high exemplification argument around this thing. But again, you have to consider, and Adam will probably jump in here at some point. The passions are what rule people. They know this. They talk about this all over the place, maybe not in the Republic, but that's the formula that Plato uses, is that what drives us is always a passion. Always. And so they are pretending like the passions don't exist until they can't ignore it, and then saying, well, whatever, and jumping over that Izod gap again by doing the religious appeal, because passions are the driver for everything, and not mimicry, and not education, and not your loyalty to the city. Like, those aren't drivers. The drivers are still in the passions.
And I think Danny lost this, and I don't know if he noticed, but they talked about the noble lie again, right? And its necessity, right? And then they compared it to medicine, and I was like, oh, right. So what is medicine? It's like, oh, hey buddy, everything is okay. Like, you're not sick. It's like, that's what medicine is. It's like, no, you're still sick. Like, the fact that you feel good for a second because you think you're not sick is like, no, you're sick.
It's interesting.
Yeah, and they went on with this, right? Because I think from the novel lie, they went into into the separating the children, and what do you tell them, right? And again, with the separation of the children, they recognize the law of nature there, right? It's like, well, we can't have these people have sex with each other, right? Because they might be family, right? And they didn't go into how they would like deal with their brothers and sisters of different age ranges or something. But anyway, like that, because I don't think it's possible to mathematically fix that
certain
problem.
weird things, like they have cycles of breeding, and like this group of people breeds at this time, and then like
Right.
going forward, it's like you're not allowed to breed with. No, they say actually you are allowed to breed with, or to fornicate with people of the same breeding time, but you can't. There's like a 7 to 9 month cycle. You can't procreate with the people above or below, because there's risks that you might.
Yeah, but he also says the law will allow brothers and sisters to have sex with one another if the lottery works out that way, and Pythia approves.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Priestess of Apollo.
Another religious appeal. Yeah. Yeah, it's chock full of these appeals that you kind of miss, because they're sentence fragments effectively, where they hit a limit and they go, yeah, well, the God's going to figure that out, and then they just move on with the argument, and it's easy to miss because it's just a couple words in a sentence, but no, it's the most important part of what's being said, usually in the paragraph. And it's like, oh, this is the most important part of the paragraph, and they just punted it to religion. Yeah, that's pretty much what they did.
So then they start talking about the laws of property, unless someone else has something they still want to get into.
Where are you, Manuel?
I have no idea. I was listening.
62, I believe.
And maybe I missed a whole bunch. Maybe you guys should take the lead, because I was in the store at this point. So you guys take the lead.
462, I think.
Oh, we're all the way there? Wow, that's...
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah, unless you guys want to like take something in the middle there.
I'd have to remember what's before 462. Oh yeah, so this is just the commonality argument around the right. It's just the commonality in education. And again, like, the interesting thing to me is the education is definitely all about exemplification and mimicry, not just about sitting in a classroom, for example, which I don't think they actually. I don't think that was their idea of education at all. I suspect that was different. So, yeah, I don't know what else to make of all that.
Schooling for the ancient Greeks could have been. There were. I mean, I know later on in Roman times they would have had something approximating a school in the sense for the pleb children, and they'd just be taken all together as a group rather than individual. But usually families would, and I expect it would be the same for a lot of well-to-do Greek families. You'd get a tutor in, or you wouldn't get a tutor at all, and you just, that's it. Because I mean, it would depend on what class you are. If you were of a kind of more wealthy disposition, you'd get tutors in, and this kind of large scale public schooling that is more modern is just completely foreign for anyone of this time period.
Yeah, that's a good contextual note because we tend to use these anachronistic way. Plus, this city doesn't exist. Like they're talking about things about education in a thing that they never built and never could build. And they knew they could never build it, so they never even tried to build it. And we're like, oh, the Greeks did this, and no, they didn't. They explicitly didn't because they figured out it isn't going to work anyway. Why would we waste our time, right? And they settled for a lot less, I guess, ultimately in terms of the ideals put forth in in the Republic anyway. They don't reach those heights.
No.
So I'm not really sure where I was going back in my notes on book 3 when they first brought out like full-fledged eugenics, just looking for common threads, and they were kind of on about like what I would, from my perspective, it seems like they were on about the vitality of the individual when they're talking about the habits of life, indolences. This is back when they're talking about and then relationship of roles. So then when they were talking in chapter 3 about like should a judge actually know evil as opposed to these other roles,
right?
Maybe you're going to want different relationships to things. Now before they get into the as Casey mentioned up, like, oh, this is not an approved child, the bastard child that's approved or not approved of the state.
Yeah.
Before they mention that, they talk about the prime of life, like men and women being in the prime of life. So I wonder if there's something there about like they're talking about something about spirit. Like, I mean, when we say somebody's in their prime, what do we mean by that? Like, why can't a 65-year-old man be in his prime of his career?
They're not talking about prime.
Right.
No, they're not talking about prime. They're talking about reproductive prime, which is there's no such thing as prime by itself. That doesn't make any sense. They're talking about reproductive prime.
Well, they say it many, many, many times. My translation certainly says both men and women. Those years are the prime of physical as well as intellectual vigor. And then.
Yeah, well, I think the word vigor is most important there, right? So
it's the context, though. They're talking about breeding up front. It starts with the breeding, and so in the context of breeding, then it's about breeding. It's not about anything else.
Right, and what does vigor mean, right? Like vigor is in some sense relation to the passion, right? Like and being ensouled, right? Being alive, right? And so why would you give people freedom if they lose their liveliness? Because they might be in control of the thing that would otherwise control them. Like I think that's what
that's how the book opened up too, with the guy on the road from the religious festival saying, "Oh, it's nice being older because the passions aren't as strong anymore." Interesting.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, but it's very important because we again we try to be these objective material realists and go, oh, well, right in this section right here, they're not using, they're not framing. Well, no, they already framed it. They're not going to keep framing it. They're just wasting words on a page at some point. So it is in the context of breeding already, and you can't take it out of that context and have it make any sense because now you're talking about something they weren't talking about.
Yeah, I suspect the translation is something like, if you look at the ancient Greek, they probably use something like arete, meaning height or peak. But I don't know. Could you give me the reference for that, Danny? For that
vigor?
For the talking about prime.
Prime
461.
461 plus or minus a little bit. D 460D-ish.
460D.
Okay. And so what are they doing, right? So we have 4 phases now. So we have the formative phase, right? Then we have the educative phase, and then we have the prime, and then we have the post-prime, right? Old age, effectively, right?
Right.
And they have different rule sets, right? Like they have different constraints upon these categories because they deal with separate problems, right? Like the first two are you going into something, right? And then at the third, in your prime, you're expressing something, but you're still getting control, or you're still working on mastering yourself, right? Like it's
Right.
so, and then in the end, like you get into this other phase, and I think they get looser the later you get, right? Which is what happens in our society as well. Right?
Yeah,
Um,
and you can see in here clearly that they're talking about child rearing, and I like that in my book it's like, so I think they will take the offspring of the good and bring them into the pen to certain nurses, right? It's like, what? The pen? You're keeping children in offsprings in pens? What's going on? Like what? Yeah, and it's all very mechanical. That's the other thing that we miss. Like all of this book is mechanical. It's all mechanical. It's all like if this, then that, this or that. This relates to this way and only this way, right? And so you do have to pay very close attention because just before the section you were talking about, Danny, if the guardian species is going to remain pure, that's the statement, right? So everything else is taken in that context from that point forward, which is when we're talking about, devices so that no one can recognize their own, can't supervise themselves, and then they go into easy kind of childbearing. Why is easy kind of childbearing important? It's important because it otherwise gets in the way of guardianship. Because again, the big telos here is guardian, the guardians. And so then they're talking about prime, right? That's the third frame that they're entering you into is, well, what is prime in the context of guardians and birth, right? And so that's why it's not just, they're not trying to define like vitality for weightlifting. They don't care about weightlifting. They care about easy birth for women and men at some point. So that it's very hard for us in modern times to try to understand framing because we're so used to inserting our own because the postmoderns say that they're all equal. So it's easy to get lost, especially in this book.
well, I think in any old book, I would say.
Well, but this book's especially tricky because they do keep switching frames on you explicitly.
I think there's some relationship to vigor and a place in hierarchy, though.
I think I found the spot where you mentioned vigor. Sorry, I
Go
interrupted.
ahead. No worries. 461.
461. Mine doesn't say the word vigor or anything like that. It just says like a man still of begetting years
Right.
or women of childbearing age. Mine
Okay.
doesn't say anything about vigor. Still unsure what the Greek word they used was. Because they might be like equivalent words in Greek. Like they would use the same words for those sorts of things, but it just depends on the context. I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
Yeah, like the reason I brought up Mark's translation for when he was laying down, I think it was 454. Yeah, 454a. Yeah, the reasoning versus his translation literally used the words heuristics and dialectic, which jump out to me as being like, oh, it smacked me in the face. My translation used really simple language, like, oh, this is a person who's just disputing over words. He's a word truthy person, right? I didn't make the connection of like, oh, jumping the is-all gap and stuff like that. And so the translation makes a big difference for sure. I like this simple elementary level translation because I like to feel good when I read it.
Mine says a quarrel in a conversation.
Interesting.
Or a disputation, conversation.
Yeah, I don't think
Verbal
I have vigor in
opposition
here either.
Verbal opposition in the spirit of contention. A not fair discussion. That's what mine said.
Is it 454?
Yeah, we're just comparing translations at 454.
Yeah, I didn't mean to like divert us. It was kind of maybe not that relevant. Back to 454.
No, it's very relevant because it does. I mean, and that's the good part about having a book club with multiple translations. And this we learned that kind of early on that
Yeah, with the
translations
Tao Te Ching,
matter
that
a
was
lot.
really interesting because they had 10 translations, and we just would like, they were next to each other, so you could read the same line multiple times, and then everybody was like, but they did this here, and what would that mean? Because like with Chinese, like that's not a linear translation to
Not even
Western
close.
language at all, right? So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
that
you had
like those things
different
actually
lengths.
said opposite things at some point, right? Like
Yep.
it was really strange to have the Chinese translations. I was like, oh yeah, this guy is a Christian. Oh yeah, this guy is just like a postmodernist. Oh, this guy is like.
Yeah, the only thing you could see was not the difference in the text so much as the difference in the translator. You're like, oh yeah, this translator's coming from this perspective, and that translator's coming from that perspective.
What book was this you're talking about?
The Tao
Tao
Te
Te
Ching.
Ching.
Okay.
Yeah, they got a great Tao Te Ching online. With what you do is you open two browsers, you get 5 in each browser in the same site, and you can compare 10 translations, and they're different lengths. The same sections are different lengths. It's really funny. It's vastly different.
Yeah, I
And then
imagine
you
you get
read that
one.
with Ecclesiastes, and then you find out there's no difference between East and West whatsoever. None. Doesn't exist. It's all imaginary.
I imagine you get one in Chinese and it's like this long, and then you get one in Spanish and it's like 3 paragraphs or something.
Yeah, yeah.
CC.
Sí, senor.
Okay, to go back to the law thing. So they're going onto laws of property, and then they start digging into personal versus collective identity, which I found highly interesting, right? And so effectively, they said when you get a transgression from the external, the internal unifies because its identity is being threatened.
Right, that's right.
Right. So if you turn that around, in order to know, right, if we lack discernment, what whole we belong to, when the whole gets threatened, do we rally to defend it? Right. Like that's kind of way a litmus test.
Do we rally to the
And
what?
well, you rally to defend the whole, right? So if someone insults America and you start defending it, it's like, oh, like you co-identify with America. You feel part of the American spirit. Now,
Yeah.
you also you can say, well, that's not an actual attack, right? But that's a different.
You say like a man, like if a man's finger gets hurt, then the entirety of his body realizes that there's a threat against the entirety and not just the finger.
Right, which is in some sense it's frame breaking, right? So in order to share the identity of the whole, you need to lose the identity of the individual. Well, right. So, and I think that's maybe the more important part, right? Because like I was talking to Danny about this, right? Like now they're going into stuff, and I was like, oh, this is what Paul talks about, right? In the Bible, like it's like what is it like to have communion, right? And in this sense, they go into the negative, right? Or they go into the utilitarian frame. Oh yeah, you should commune because it's better for you to be part of a community, effectively, right? Or you should commune because like else you're gonna get hurt, right? Like and it's all this negative framing. While when in the Bible they start saying, well, through faith, hope, and love, right? Like there's an aspiration introduced in the unity as opposed to just the utilitarian thing. And I was wondering if Plato was going to make that step too, because that would be interesting to see how he does that.
Yeah, I don't know. We're getting up on time here, Manuel. What do you want to do?
We did.
Yeah,
we
no,
started
I
15
think
minutes late too. I don't know if you guys want to cut at 11 or go to 11:15.
yeah, I think we're somewhat in the middle.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're definitely just
I can bring some observation in, right? Because it's kind of on this thing, but I wanted to bring it in at the start, and we didn't, because we were talking about Discord, and at least that was the word that they were using in the translation that I was hearing, right? And so Discord is connected to the internal, right? So there's dysregulation within the internal state, and then war is dysregulation between the outside and the inside. And so I found that idea really interesting, right? And so the implication there is that through the expansion of identity, we can resolve things through Discord by apparently different rules that are aimed at resolving things between pieces, right? So I think this is what all the globalists wanted to do, right? Like they want to reduce war to Discord by being part of the same body, and then what they're basically saying is, well, like if you're having Discord, you're not aimed at the destruction of the other, right? Like that's effectively because you share a dependency.
Yes, we share. Right. What section is that, Manuel? Because I don't think
That's a bunch later, but not much.
470 roughly. They're
470B.
talking about Greeks and.
But I'm not going into the book. I was more thinking about the implications about society, right?
Yeah, no, there's a section on that earlier where to your point, they make a distinction
That is
between
at the
war
start
and
of
something
the
else.
chapter.
Yes.
No, I don't know if they're making one between Discord and war.
Yeah, but it is war and something else, right? And this goes back to that whole idea of hostile versus enemy in the Bible. It's the same problem with the German translation because there's a difference between a hostile and an enemy.
Well,
Yeah, there's that which is internal, the internal. So that hostiles being the political, or not the political, the enemy of the state who's coming in outside trying to destroy it, and then inimicos meaning somebody who's within the state, who is just under the same head, but let's say you differ. There's a kind of differing of how you're relating, and maybe you don't like each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and dehumanization is the word that they use in modern discourse, right? Like if we're dehumanizing them, if we're ordering them, that is a war space instead of a Discord space.
Right. And the solution really is have a single body. It's just that doesn't work and it's stupid. So
right. So how do we appeal to the unifying principle, and what is its strength? Right, and then I got this thing. It's like the intimacy builds over time, right? So you can't just state the body. No, there needs to be a participation within the body, and you need to be in a role. And then because you co-identify with that, then you co-identify with the body as well. And so that's the thing that necessarily takes time. And if you look at these postmodern people, right, with their allyship, right, like the allyship is the attempt to create an artificial body because like you're allied, right? And it's not only just allies in general, right? Like allies in general is like, oh, we're gonna be together because it's convenient, right? And allyship cannot hold in and of itself because it doesn't have the intimacy, right? You need a binding agent to be intimate around, and that cannot be something subjective like an internal identity, right? So because I cannot be intimate with you around your experience, like that's not an option for me. And I think so the intimacy crisis and a fake making of intimacy and a not putting the intimacy within the right framing is the why these things can't hold and why they're evil, like at the same time. And so now we're back to like a utility argument, right? Like so every time the argument is like the thing that you do cannot exist and therefore it's evil. Yeah, that was my little sermon about that.
Yeah. Well, I'll just give some historical context to this as well, because they're talking about who is a Greek and who isn't in this. And within the same two generations of these men talking about it, the Macedonians, who were largely considered to be barbarians, that is, not Greeks, outside of the body of Greece, under Philip II, and then later who and his son Alexander the Great. And I don't even think it was at that time particularly, but it was Alexander the Great and Philip of Macedon fight to take up the cause of Greece against the Persians. So they were harking back to Thermopylae, to this great event that united the Greeks, even though they were Macedonians, even though they were considered barbarians. And by the time you get to maybe 100 years after this, where this dialogue is taking place, Macedonians and Greeks are within the same body. They're both considered to be Greeks, and the Greeks don't consider the Macedonians to be barbarians. They consider the Romans to be barbarians, but the Macedonians are as Greek as the rest of them, so far as they're concerned. So
That's interesting. Well, yeah, and there's no Greeks left in Greece. So,
yeah.
oops. They're all
And
gone.
it's also
Adam, are you saying that they cast a specific group of people in the way that they wanted to because it was convenient to them? Is that because
No, it wasn't
No.
convenience.
Okay.
No, the Macedonians took up the cause. The Macedonians under Alexander the Great and under Philip. Firstly, they united Greece actually as a political body, and then they gathered all of their men in. They gathered an army and they went off to fight the Persians, who, as I had mentioned previously, were these kind of far off great barbarians. The worst of the barbarians, because of course, if you think back to the 300, or let's say, or the Battle of Thermopylae, that is the kind of you can see it as a kind of coalescing point of a lot of the Greeks, or the kind of the identity of Greek, and by them taking part in the retribution for that by conquering the Persian Empire, completely reversing what happened at Thermopylae ultimately. Firstly, they spread the Greek language around. Like, the reason why a lot of the Bible manuscripts are written in Greek is because, and the reason it's spread in that way was because of Alexander the Great, ultimately, because he spread the Greek language, he spread Greek culture, and by that way of doing things, he attached himself and the Macedonians as a people who did speak Greek even beforehand, but they were still considered barbarians. So this is how it goes. They were eventually then woven into, made part of the body of Greece.
Yeah, and so the difference in ancient times, though, Danny, is culture. It's total culture. They understood that different cultures existed, and that's why they were city-states, and they would unite as convenient, right? Because the culture of Sparta and the culture of Athens have no overlap.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what I think. I don't know if Manuel said this. I have it written down. So on the difference between war and discord, they say discord is like you're at war with the other states that are external, but internally we're unified. So there's a unifying principle to our state, which is why we're going to say, well, when we're going to fight amongst ourselves, we're going to call that discord and not war.
Right.
And Manuel made a statement that maybe discord is not being aimed at the destruction of the other. So
that's in the text as well.
Is it in the text?
Yeah, like the telos in discord is peace.
Oh, they're explicit about that. Okay, that's peace. Okay, so there's
peace is possible in that situation, but peace is not possible with your enemy ever.
Right. Then it's victory, right? Whatever that means.
Okay, because peace is not the same thing as intimacy. So, like, if I say our state's going to have an allyship, and we need, like you said, we need a binding agent to be intimate around, that cannot be peace only.
No, peace is the result. It's a second order effect.
A second order effect. Okay. So then the higher order, then the thing that unifies us as a state is what? A desire for peace?
No, it's the spirit of the state.
Okay. So first of all, right, I was going to go into this, right? So the thing that Adam talked about is integration and assimilation, right? So there's this identity, right? And if that identity gets confused with my identity, then we at a certain point share sameness in such a way, right? But we only share sameness in a specific domain, right? And you could call that culture or whatever, right? So for example, like I might side with America if we're going against China, but like I might not side with America if we're going against South Africa or whatever, right? Like, because my identity or the things, the sharedness within that one conflict is different than the sharedness between the other conflicts. So I assume a different identity. So you can appeal to me as part of a body, right? If I have an identity within that body, right? And then the more intimate I am with that identity, the stronger appeal you can make. And so and Adam might go into this, right? Like, so this idea of an empire, right, was an identity that was only shared based upon like some high rulership, and it wasn't shared among peopleship, right? Like the peoples were strictly kept separate within an empire, but there was still a ruling acceptance, like a legal sharing that was submitted to.
Yeah, that's right. So a good example might be the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but closer to the context that we're talking about here. If you think of Alexander's empire, he never made them take on Greek culture, let's say, or start speaking Greek, right? That just came about because basically it just made administration easier. But the Persians were part of the, let's say, part under the head of Alexander, and the Greeks at that time were as well, and they both had their relationship, their particular relationship with him. Another good example is Egypt. So Alexander is pharaoh to the Egyptians, right? But to the Greeks he is he's just Alexander, or King Alexander. And this is a good example of this is when, so in the Persians, for instance, the way they and to the Persians, he's the Shahanshah, the king of kings, because he displaces Darius. And the way the Persians relate to Alexander, how they show him that they're allied, or they bear allegiance to them, that he's their head, is that they prostrate themselves fully on the ground before him. Whereas and this caused controversy, but to the Greeks, that's just not on the table. They still recognize him, even the Macedonians, right? They still recognize him as their king, but they have a way of relating to him that's not the same as the way the Persians do. But nevertheless, there's a way in which they're both under the same head. And in fact, they're so much under the same head that even after Alexander dies, you have this spreading of Greek language and culture to the point where it becomes a trading language throughout the entirety of Mesopotamia and Iran.
Right. And that's the keeping of the intimacy, is keeping of the title. So you don't try to retitle Egypt and their pharaoh into king, right? And you don't try to make the Greeks bow down the way the Persians do. And why? Because that's a mistake. You need to keep the intimate relationship with the head intact, even though it's the same, say, physical head. That doesn't matter, right? This goes back to earlier, right? It doesn't matter that men and women are different. It matters the purpose of guardian. It doesn't matter that the titles, that the person's the same. It matters that the titles are different, because that's where the intimacy comes from. That's where a relationship comes from. It's a big, deep mistake that Napoleon makes, that actually Adam and I talk about on Navigating Patterns, right? In the French Revolution talk, we talk about this error, because you're supposed to have different roles in different places in relation to different cultures. And when you don't maintain the difference, you try to make everything equal in outcome, and it does. It gets destroyed immediately.
And if you don't live out the role, you're alienating the people from you, right? So like
Yes.
if you're pharaoh and the pharaoh has to do this every year and then you're gone for 10 years, then you alienated the country. But if you've done it every year and you just submit it to the customs, then they wouldn't have much problem accepting.
Right.
And that's not absolute. You can change the custom to some extent, but only so
Sure.
far. And like these things aren't knowable. They're not hard lines. We like hard lines. We don't have hard lines. It's not the world we were born into.
Yeah, I mean, a good example of this in the Egyptian context is all the Roman emperors are still represented like the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, even though they're 2,000 years removed from them, on the wall with the hieroglyphs. But at the same time, the governorship of Egypt would have changed. The customs would have changed. Let's say in tax collection, because beforehand it might have been that it was all sort of what it was all gathered. The way it worked is that they would all the seeds would be gathered up and then distributed by Pharaoh's men. The Romans, by the time Egypt goes later, it might have changed that. And by the time of the end of the Roman Empire in the West, like I don't even think the emperor had the title of pharaoh anymore. So
I was watching one of those Korean shows, and they were changing a law to something absurd, and the guy says like there's no precedent for this, like since the beginning of our empire this never happened. And then they said, well, but in this other kingdom upon which our legal system is based, once upon a time they had this one law 1,000 years ago,
yeah,
and then it was okay, like then it was accepted. So wow, okay.
yeah.
Well, you got to base it off of something, and the past is a good way to go. Historical grounding is important.
So yeah, I think we're gonna go more into bodies and what makes you part of a body, right? And I think more importantly, what makes you feel part of a body, right? Because like that's the binding element, and the way that I was gonna say the body derives authority, but it's not authority. It's cohesion or integrity. That's the words that I'm using. And yeah, right. And so this goes also into foolishness, right? Like what is foolishness? Being divided within yourself, right? Like oh, okay, right? Like that means that there's like these conception of the telos is not shared among the body, and then you can even get a split personality. So yeah. So is everybody okay, or do we want to like hash something out still?
I'd be okay if I weren't tired.
Yeah, I'm good.
I'm good. I thought you had like a load of awesome insights today, Manuel. So
I still have plenty, dude. Like,
yeah, I'm
Well,
excited
we
about
get to
the second
them
half of
next
chapter
week.
5. Chapter 5. This chapter I struggle with more than any other. The first half of chapter 5. This was the hardest one for me.
Really?
But yeah, the second half is really good. I can see how all the threads connect in the second half of chapter 5. When we're going towards absolute justice and beauty, things come together. But yeah, I struggled with this. So
Interesting. It's the easiest chapter in the book for me so far, the first half. Like, this is all, yeah, sure, yeah, granted, except the revelations of like, oh no, Plato was explicit about dialectic having nothing to do with opposition ever. Like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. I'm not surprised, but I'm pleased.
Yeah. So try figure out relevant bits for you in a reflection, and then try to integrate them in setting an intention of how to sense make during the week, and then we can meet again around that.